The air reeked of rot as I stepped out of the Foundation vehicle, my boots sinking into the wet, sucking mud of Orem Marsh. Officially, I was here to investigate SCP-7441, an anomaly described as a sentient, semi-physical mist with suspected mimetic properties. The locals had simpler names for it: the Black Veil, or Death's Fog. The village bordering the marsh was a ghost town. The few remaining residents avoided my gaze, slamming doors and drawing curtains as I passed. Their fear was palpable, a tension that clung to the air like the mist creeping over the landscape. "Agent Kepler," my comm crackled, "exercise extreme caution. SCP-7441 is highly dangerous. Do not trust your senses." I looked toward the marsh, the fog shifting in deliberate waves as if aware of my presence. My first step into the swamp felt like crossing a threshold into a predator's lair, the dense, unnatural silence pressing in on me from all sides. A local hunter named Carter had agreed to guide me. He stood at the edge of the marsh, his face lined with years of hardship and his eyes wary. "You sure about this?" he asked, gripping his rifle tightly. "That fog ain't natural. It takes people, then I don't have a choice," I replied, adjusting my pack. Without another word, we started into the swamp. The further we went, the darker it grew, the towering cypress trees blocking out what little light remained. The fog thickened with each step, curling around us like cold, damp fingers. Carter muttered under his breath, and I caught fragments. "Don't stop. Don't breathe too deep. Don't look too long." Curiosity gnawed at me. "What happens if I do?" I asked, my voice quieter than intended. He stopped abruptly, turning to face me. His expression was pale and hollow, his eyes darting to the shifting fog. "You'll see things that ain't real," he said, voice trembling. "Or worse, things that are." Half an hour into the marsh, I started to feel the pressure. The fog wasn't just around us. It was inside my head. My thoughts felt sluggish, like I was wading through molasses. Shapes moved at the edges of my vision, fleeting and indistinct. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Carter seemed unaffected, or maybe he was just better at ignoring it. "Keep moving," he said, his voice low and steady. "The veil gets stronger the longer you stay. It feeds off hesitation." A low, guttural sound rumbled through the swamp, vibrating through the ground beneath my boots. It was distant, but unmistakably alive, like an animal growling, but distorted. "What was that?" I asked, my voice breaking the tense silence. Carter didn't answer right away. His grip on the rifle tightened, and his eyes scanned the shifting fog. Finally, he whispered, "Just pray it doesn't find us." We stumbled upon an old cabin, half sunk into the marsh. The door hung ajar, creaking softly with the wind. Carter stopped, his face hardening. "This wasn't here before." We cautiously entered. The inside was worse. Rotting furniture, mud-streaked walls, and the unmistakable stench of decay. A journal lay on the table, its pages warped with damp. I flipped it open, the entries growing increasingly frantic. The writer's descent into madness was clear. "It knows you," one entry read. "The veil calls you by name. It speaks in voices you trust." The final line sent a chill down my spine. "It knows your name. It speaks in voices you trust." As I read, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, stretching unnaturally. The temperature dropped. Then, a faint whisper, too quiet to ignore, brushed against my ears. "Kepler." The hairs on my neck stood on end. Back outside, the whispers grew louder, filling the air with an eerie familiarity. They sounded like voices from my past. My mother's gentle lullaby, my late partner's soft chuckle, even the stern tone of old colleagues. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice cracking. Carter didn't answer immediately. He just shook his head, his expression hard. "That's the veil working on you. Don't listen." But the voices were so convincing. They weren't just whispers. They felt real, alive. One called out, pleading, "Come back, Kepler. You don't belong here. It's not too late." I hesitated, my feet shifting, almost turning back. The pull was overwhelming. But then Carter grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. "You look back, and it's over," he said, his voice a low growl. The weight of his words hit me, cold and sharp, grounding me in the present. The fog pressed in closer. The growling returned, much closer this time. Carter froze, his eyes scanning the fog, fear creeping into his voice. "It's hunting us," he whispered. "What is?" Call it the Veil's Enforcer, Carter said, his voice low and urgent. You'll know it when you see it. The fog parted briefly, revealing a massive, shadowy figure. It moved like a wolf, its body sleek but wrong. Too many limbs, each tipped with claws that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. The air grew colder, and the ground seemed to hum beneath our feet. Carter didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot rang out, deafening, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a bone-chilling howl that vibrated through my chest, then charged at us with terrifying speed, its limbs stretching forward, claws snapping. I felt my heart race as the creature closed the distance between us. We ran, the swamp pulling at our legs like it wanted to swallow us whole. The creature pursued relentlessly, its growls morphing into a deep, guttural laughter that echoed through the fog. Every step felt heavier, the mud clinging to my boots and slowing me down. I tripped over a hidden root and fell hard, the impact knocking the air from my lungs. Mud splattered across my face, and I struggled to push myself up. The laughter grew louder, closer. Carter turned, his hands trembling as he raised his rifle and fired again. The crack of the shot cut through the air, and this time the creature stopped. Its form seemed to ripple, its shadowy body distorting like liquid before it melted back into the fog, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Why did it stop? I gasped, struggling to catch my breath. Carter's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. It doesn't kill you right away, sir, he said, his voice trembling. It plays with you first. We stumbled into a clearing, the fog thinning to reveal symbols carved into the surrounding trees. At the center stood a stone altar, slick with moss, and something darker that glistened unnaturally. This is it, Carter said, his voice trembling. What is it? I asked. He hesitated. A place where people made sacrifices. They thought it kept the Veil at bay. I felt an inexplicable pull toward the altar, my feet moving before I could stop myself. The air grew heavy, charged with something oppressive. I reached out, brushing the cold, damp surface with my fingertips. Instantly, my mind was overwhelmed with vivid and horrifying images. Faces twisted in agony, bodies dragged screaming into the fog. Their terror so real it felt like my own. I staggered back, gasping for air. Carter grabbed my arm, his grip firm. Don't touch it, he warned, his voice sharp. You don't want it knowing you're here. After leaving the clearing, I felt different. The fog pressed harder against my skull, and the whispers grew louder, their words becoming more coherent. They weren't just murmurs anymore. They were sentences, commands, even pleas. You shouldn't have touched it, Carter said, keeping his distance now. His voice was edged with something I hadn't heard before. Fear. I didn't respond. My thoughts weren't mine anymore. Images of the altar, the creature, and the endless swamp played on a loop in my head, growing more vivid with each step. Worse, Carter's face began to shift. His eyes darkened until they were pits of black, his skin twisting and warping like melting wax. Are you real? I asked, my voice breaking as I fought to anchor myself. He stopped and turned toward me, his expression grim. You're slipping, Kepler, he said, his voice sharp, almost commanding. Focus. If you don't, the Veil will take you and you won't come back. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time lost all meaning in the marsh, the endless fog blurring any sense of reality. Eventually, we reached what felt like the epicenter, a massive sinkhole where the fog churned like a living thing, thick and impenetrable. Carter stopped at the edge, his rifle hanging limply at his side. This is as far as I go, he said, his voice low and resigned. Why? I asked, my breath hitching. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the swirling fog ahead. Because that's where it lives, he said. His tone was final, leaving no room for argument. Before I could press him further, the ground beneath me shifted. The soft, wet earth gave way, and I slid uncontrollably into the sinkhole. Carter didn't move to help. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. The last thing I saw before the fog consumed me entirely was Carter turning away, his silhouette dissolving into the mist as if he'd never been there at all. I landed hard, the impact driving the air from my lungs. The fog in the sinkhole was heavier, almost tangible, pressing against me like a living thing. My flashlight flickered as I stood, its beam revealing walls lined with pulsating black veins that seemed to shift and writhe. The voices grew louder, no longer whispers, but commanding and insistent. Kepler, stay! Kepler, listen, they chanted, overlapping in a maddening chorus. At the center of the pit was a dark, glassy pool, its surface unnaturally still. I stepped closer, my flashlight revealing my reflection, but it wasn't me. The face staring back was twisted and monstrous, its features warped, with empty, yawning sockets where my eyes should have been. A chill ran through me, and I stumbled back, but the reflection didn't vanish. Instead, it moved on its own, its mouth twisting into a cruel grin. Then it spoke in a voice that wasn't mine. This is where you belong. The fog above the pool shifted, coalescing into a towering, humanoid shape. It was featureless, its form twisting and changing like liquid smoke. I knew instantly this was SCP-7441 in its purest form. You are not the first, it said, its voice 1,000 tones layered over one another, each one more alien than the last. And you will not be the last. I tried to speak, but my throat tightened, choking off my words before they could form. My mind flooded with horrifying images. Hunters, researchers, even soldiers, each one trapped in the veil, their faces twisted in silent, eternal screams. The entity's hand stretched toward me, impossibly long, its fingers bending in ways that shouldn't be possible. The fog thickened, swirling around me like a predator closing in. I felt my body grow heavy, my limbs weak, as if the very air was draining my strength. The weight of the veil pressed down on me, and I realized there was no escape. Before the entity's hand could touch me, I shouted, "Wait!" The hand paused, hovering inches from my chest. The creature tilted its head, as if studying me, its form rippling like smoke. "You wish to bargain?" I nodded, desperation flooding my senses. "You don't want me. I'm just a scout, but I can bring you more." The entity's shape shifted, its formless face twisting into what seemed like a smile, though it was grotesque and wrong. "Interesting. What do you propose?" I hesitated, fear gnawing at my resolve, but I pushed forward. "Let me leave, and I'll bring you something better. Someone important." The entity's form drew closer, its presence suffocating. "If you fail, you will return to me willingly. Do you accept?" The words hung in the air, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. And I knew that whatever I agreed to, there would be no turning back. The fog around me thinned, and the suffocating weight lifted. I found myself back in the marsh, the sinkhole nowhere in sight. Carter was gone. The swamp was eerily silent, the fog receding to the edges of my vision. I stumbled forward, disoriented, then radioed in, my voice trembling. "This is Agent Kepler. Mission incomplete. Requesting extraction." The comms crackled before a response came through, cold and distant. "Acknowledged. Extraction en route." As I waited, my mind raced, the entity's words repeating like a haunting refrain. "If you fail, you will return to me willingly." I had bought my freedom, but at what cost? And now, I had to deliver. Who would I give to SCP-7441? The question gnawed at me, its answer already forming in the darkest corners of my mind. As the fog closed in once again, I couldn't help but wonder if this was just the beginning. Back at Site 19, I sat across from Dr. Min Elkin, the head of the SCP-7441 project. She studied me intently, her pen tapping against the clipboard in her hands. "You survived," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "That's unusual." "I don't know how," I lied. "The fog. It let me go." Her gaze sharpened. "What did it say to you?" "Nothing coherent," I replied quickly, forcing my voice steady. "Just whispers, memories. It didn't seem interested in me." Dr. Elkin didn't look convinced, but she didn't press further. "We'll need a full report, and, Kepler, don't fool yourself. You're not free of SCP-7441. It doesn't let go so easily." The weight of her words settled over me. The fog, the entity, they hadn't just let me go. They had chosen to, and that thought was far worse than anything I'd faced in the marsh. The first night back, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the veil, the dark pool, the entity, and the faces of those it had consumed. Their silent screams burned into my mind. Worse, I felt it, like the veil had followed me. The shadows in my room seemed unnaturally thick, shifting in ways they shouldn't. I swore I heard whispers in the silence. Faint but persistent, calling my name, urging me to listen. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every corner of the room felt alive, as if the veil had seeped into my space. By morning, I was certain of one thing. SCP-7441 hadn't just let me go. It had marked me. The whispers, the shadows, they were constant reminders. The veil was patient. It had chosen me, and one day it would come for me again. The Foundation assigned me to another project, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back to the veil and the bargain I'd made. Then the dreams started. They weren't just nightmares. They were instructions. The entity showed me faces and names. All Foundation personnel. It wanted them, and it wanted me to deliver. I tried to resist, but the pressure grew unbearable. The whispers turned into screams, relentless and deafening. Every reflection I saw twisted into that grotesque version of myself, its hollow, blackened eyes staring back. The entity's voice echoed in my mind, cold and commanding. Fulfill your promise or return to me. I felt trapped, cornered by a deal I could no longer ignore. The veil's reach was infinite, its grip unshakable. I realized I couldn't outrun it. My choice was clear. Complete the task or surrender to the darkness waiting to reclaim me. The entity's chosen target was Dr. Elkin, one of the Foundation's most brilliant and invaluable researchers. Delivering her to the veil would be a betrayal of everything I once stood for. And yet I couldn't see a way out. The veil's influence was growing stronger every day, its whispers louder, its grip tighter. I felt like a puppet, my strings pulled by an unseen hand. Resistance seemed futile. One night, I followed Elkin as she left Site 19. She lived in a secluded house, far from prying eyes. Perfect for what the veil demanded. From the shadows, I watched her through a window, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of my coat. "You don't have to do this," I whispered to myself. But the words rang hollow. Deep down, I knew it was already too late. The veil had chosen her, and I was nothing more than its instrument. My choice had been stripped away the moment I made that bargain. Elkin's screams echoed in my ears as I dragged her into the marsh. I'd knocked her unconscious, but the fog seemed to revive her. She stirred as we neared the sinkhole, her eyes snapping open, wide with terror. "Kepler, stop, please," she begged, her voice trembling. I couldn't meet her gaze. My hands shook, but I kept moving, the fog thickening around us like a living cocoon. It seemed to guide me, pushing me forward. The sinkhole loomed ahead, its black pool shimmering faintly with an unnatural glow. As we reached the edge, the entity emerged, its towering, shifting form filling the air with its oppressive presence. "You have done well," it said, its voice a cacophony of tones that rattled my skull. I dropped Elkin at the pool's edge, bile rising in my throat as I watched the veil's tendrils snake out, wrapping around her limbs. Her screams pierced the air as it dragged her into the abyss. Her pleading eyes, the last thing I saw before she vanished. The fog receded, and I was alone again. The weight of what I'd done pressed down on me, unbearable. But the whispers had stopped. For now. Back at Site 19, no one questioned Elkin's disappearance. The Foundation wrote it off as another casualty of SCP-7441, just another researcher lost to the anomaly. Only I knew the truth, and it hollowed me out. But the reprieve was short-lived. A week later, the dreams returned, vivid and relentless. This time, they showed me another face, another name, another target. The veil wasn't finished with me. It never would be. I realized, with cold certainty, that I was bound to it. As much as I hated what I'd become, I knew I would obey, because the alternative was far worse than death. It was becoming one with the veil. For more tales born from the depths of husk and horror, subscribe to Huskborn Horrors, where the fog whispers and the shadows have stories to tell.